What a pleasure to be able to bring this to both new and existing audiences for, I think, what is probably one of the most topical things right now, of which we just felt so compelled after so many different conversations to do something about it. So today, we're going straight into it. We are going to talk about the state of sustainability in AI in 2026. It is changing a lot and has changed a lot even in the last couple of months. So if you talked about it or heard about it just a few months ago, things are also shifting very rapidly. We'll dive into AI system lifecycle impacts, which I think a lot of people are very, very curious to learn about. Matthias will be diving into that alongside some of the regulatory landscape that may not be as prominent right now in the US, but is actually super important for us to know. And then looking at impact measurement, and I probably am burying the lead, but what we are launching, which is an accelerator in October. So stay tuned and we'll answer all of your questions. So who's in the room? Man, unbelievable. We have, I think, probably around 300 signups once you include our Academy graduates. What's interesting is letting you know who's in the room because it's important to know who's interested in these topics. Well, the majority of people are in a climate role, which is very fascinating. There are people who are in other business functions, but it's very interesting to sort of see that this is a very topical thing that we had talked to many different professionals about, and they're dealing with it right now. How do we deal with AI that's raising the bar of what's possible at the same time not burning our own planet? And what you want to explore is around, say, the data centers, the impact. How do you use this in climate work? And that makes a lot of sense. Where regulations, although it's the lowest, that's not to say that it's not important, but I can understand why it's lower down on the bar because these things haven't sort of come up yet. I mean, they're starting to bubble up in the EU and the UK, but they will be coming, and that will cause a lot of changes that we want to get ahead of. So for those that don't know us, we are a climate advisory and academy. We've been working across 13 different countries. We've trained over 14,000 people. Like our bread and butter is making sure that we use the work that we do in industry and turn them into practitioner-led training. And this is no shortage of what we've done many times before and kind of are revisiting it in this new age of sustainability and AI. I am leading training whilst Matthias is leading our industry work. So we're the perfect two to tag team today on really giving you a deep dive into it. And just as a snapshot, we've worked on a bunch of things and we make sure that we work on things before we upskill. So if you ask, is this information fully available on your AI? Well, in a lot of senses, especially our case studies, no, because they're not trained in these models. And we've been working with a lot of the leading tech firms on key areas like workload optimization, their hardware and operations, and even looking at our own digital and AI footprinting, which just hasn't been done out there. So many thanks for people. I think I saw Susanna out there who helped work with us on the AI side of the digital missions we had. And because of this, our work has been featured by LinkedIn Green Skills, and also Forbes listed us as one of the top professional development fellowships in energy and climate for our flagship academy program. So we are really excited to show you what we have unpacked, which is taking information that we're finding from reports, but also from many, many people that we've spoken to. So let's dive in first. AI definitely has the potential to drive forward sustainability. Now, this is a Capgemini report that was released in 2026. It looked at 2,000 executives that are leading firms that have over $1 billion in revenue. And what they found, even in late 2024, was that a third of them were already using generative AI. So for those that aren't as familiar, AI are the systems that predict, classify, or optimize like existing data, say like forecasting energy demand or things like that. Whereas generative AI is a subset, which is where you create new context. It's like the text, the code, the images. It's like when you're using large language models. These are kind of what we use AI for within sustainability work. Well, organizations that are the largest in the world were already piloting them to drive forward sustainability initiatives or kind of helping with other different functions to get the work done. However, more than 2/3 of these executives expected AI would cut their emissions, which is a bit odd, right? And I think that what they're thinking about is the long-term reduction in GHG emissions, not the short-term. And that's where the issue lies. Most of these organizations have not measured their environmental footprint of their Gen AI use. So in classic OPF fashion, and people watch The Muppets, Meets one of my favorites, are we trying to fix the planet whilst burning it in the process? I mean, this is literally the challenge, right? We, for the last 18 months, have kind of advised the world's largest tech companies on this work, and a lot of this is still kind of under the wraps, but will be coming out. And we've spoken to over 1,000 practitioners this year alone. I mean, we've done call after call. And one theme kept on coming up, which is AI could accelerate sustainability progress, but its environmental costs are not fully accounted for. And the big, hairy question, which keeps us up at night, is what if we're doing more harm than good? And this is literally the dilemma that we felt inclined to step up on. And this webinar is the start of this, but it's just the first step. And there's so much more to share. And this really is something that we're both excited to do, but also feel a very, very heavy conviction. I haven't felt this way since 3 years ago when we first launched the Academy, when we needed more people on net zero. It's very, very clear that the spotlight and the changes in the world today around AI need to be a tool for good, but also can't be ignored in terms of how we responsibly use it. So let's dive into the facts. These are the top data set things that people should know and likely already predicted. Data centers are consuming energy and water at alarming rates. In fact, if you look at the global energy demand, it's 1.5% in 2024, which accounts for basically half of the United Kingdom's country emissions. Like this is getting huge, and this was in 2024. And the trajectory that we're moving towards means that these data centers are going to use 2 times electricity consumption from 2024 to 2030 if we don't change how we are powering our AI movement. And if you look at that from water terms, that's 2.5 trillion liters a year of a water footprint. So I calculated this in gallons for my US counterparts. That's 660 billion gallons of water per year, or 1.8 billion gallons a day, just used on the current cooling system if I think technology remains the same and if we have this hyperscale to 2030. Now, I'm no kind of like water expert, but when it comes to 1.8 billion gallons, I mean, that is like a huge amount of water that's needed for direct cooling, indirect water use, and energy generation. Now, we should take these with a grain of salt because 2030 and the applications of forecastings are uncertain. And this may also rely on assumptions of, technology maybe not developing as quickly and ideally us using less energy and water to be able to use our AI systems. But this is the thing that you do need to know that is a fact. And if you look at it one level deeper, not just on the energy and water, AI is becoming, if not is, one of the largest infrastructure build-outs in US history. And this is only compared to, as a percentage of GDP, close enough to US railroads, interstate highway systems, and even the Apollo space program. And this is a percentage of spending compared to overall GDP in the United States. And this is the CapEx that Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and Alphabet Group are projected to invest into their AI systems. And this is kind of insane. These percentage marks on GDP, especially with US being one of the largest GDPs in the globe, means that a huge amount of change is going to be also happening with our infrastructures. And I've talked to many people here on this call and beyond that have mentioned, well, data centers in my backyard, no way. And there has been a lot of movement in terms of the development of these data centers, but also the impacts that they are having in even local communities. And I'm noticing that happening right now. So this is also going to transform like the buildings and cities and even the structural elements of our country, which is crazy. And if you talk to the same executives, you will find that half of them agree that Gen AI is likely to increase their organization's emissions. Like executives are not silly, right? Even if we didn't tell you the exact data from energy and water, across all 12 core industries from these executives, half of them are expecting that their emissions are going to go up. And as a result of that, and this is the scary part, 42% of these executives agree that with Gen AI, they will have to relook at their original sustainability goals and commitments. So what this means is that AI use is already at risk of undermining sustainability targets, even though a third of these companies are trying to use them for the better good. And if you look at this from late 2024, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's still very low, only 12% of these organizations plan to measure their footprint, and less than a quarter, or just like roughly a quarter, have even targets to even think about reducing them. And for those that are kind of like business minded, you might be going, well, that makes sense. And yes, it makes sense because if you look at the priorities for AI in consideration of selecting and building Gen AI models, environmental footprinting is right at the bottom, right? You can talk to any executive, right? Right now they're dealing with how do we drive revenue? How do we stop ourselves from being disrupted? How do we make sure that it's safe, that it's cost competitive? Like there's so many other things that are getting put in a higher priority than environmental footprinting. And our question to the group here, and especially with many people who are working in this field, is how do we raise the priority and the profile of environmental impacts? Because at the end of the day, environmental costs are business costs, whether we pay for them now or later. It's the same thing with climate risk, right? And in some ways, we need to sort of figure that out. And if I was just to sort of encapsulate this, well, you're sitting there going, well, what can I personally do? Well, if you look at MetLife's recent survey of HR leaders and employees, more than two-thirds of employees will admit that AI is creating new friction and mistrust between employees and management. More than two-thirds of employers are feeling friction and mistrust. And I've talked to many different professionals who I've invited even to this webinar who have mentioned, yeah, my organization's asking me to use more AI, but we also are trying to be climate conscious. How does those two things live together? Or why am I getting forced to use AI just in general to like what put myself out of a job? So there is a lot of this issue, which creates, I think, an opportunity for employees to have like a larger say within their organization, even if you're not in the sustainability or climate role, to be able to raise up a certain change that you can influence much more than you think. And so why are executives not acting? And I think this is great for the primer. More than three of the four reasons are solvable. Now, these are the top four reasons why executives are citing that they're not measuring their Gen AI footprint. One is lack of transparency from model providers, and we totally understand. So for those that haven't followed the latest, Claude, OpenAI, many of the big LLMs don't really publicly disclose enough information for users to be able to accurately and precisely measure their impacts, right? They've got, whether it's the lack of regulations, they're hyperscaling, they're not giving us the information. However, if you look at this, there are ways to measure it. And that's actually one thing. Watershed actually recently launched a methodology, which I highly recommend you take a look at. There are ways where organizations and professionals are getting beyond this. But if you look at the last top three reasons, lack of AI impact awareness, that's an awareness, that's an understanding issue in the leadership team, which can be solved by workforce upskilling. It's the very same trend that we saw about 4 years ago with what is net zero, what is GHG accounting? Well, now people are like, well, what impacts are AI actually having for us and what can we actually do about it? Leadership is not as informed. In fact, most professionals are not properly informed just because of the rate of informational flows that are happening now and where to trust that. And that's where we've always wanted to be that trusted authority with what we share. Number two is too complex to measure, right? There's a lot of different guidances out there. And I will say that we have talked to a bunch of different tech firms. Some are waiting for guidance to come. Others are trying to lead on that guidance. So as we move forward, more and more of this information is going to come up. And Matthias will share more about this. But we do need to dive more into the impacts and what role we can have to reduce those impacts itself. And then prioritizing efficiency improvements over environmental impact. So that's just sort of like, where are we focused, right? And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for even policy, governance, even how we buy, build, and scale AI responsibly. So people know me, I can't help myself but to tease something, but like we are literally working hard because we are launching our own Sustainability and AI Accelerator for professionals that are wanting to take action today. So I'm talking about people who are willing to commit to learning and producing an organizational ready output. These are the top three things that I think organizations can start with or you can have within your portfolio. Number one is your AI governance and policy, right? We are just about to publish our policy document, which should come out this week. We worked on it so hard and we've been looking at other policies. That's a great place to start. The second one is how do you actually measure the lifecycle impacts of the AI, whether you're a consumer, even up to the point of which you're developing it and have an action plan, because there's many things that you can do. And then finally, it's how do you buy, build, and scale AI responsibly? We're not saying don't use AI for climate work because we need that, but how do you scale it responsibly? And how do you make sure that you're putting the onus on the people who are selling you this technology? So I have much more to share about this, but I just wanted to tease this out. Whether you can't join for the whole entire webinar, you will get an email, but I highly recommend. We'd love to hear from you And we always love to be able to pull more information. But this is very much an accelerator, not an academy, where it's focused on developing org-ready outputs that can be inserted within organizations or become part of a portfolio of work. So with that, let's just dive into it. There's more than meets the eye. So the very, very first thing that I'll talk about is we talked about the rising electricity demand and also the water consumption and the community backlash. If you look at it from an iceberg model, there is way more than sees that meets the eye, right? We have patterns of behavior, whether there's growth of compute demand, adoption of AI. We also have the system structures, which are our electricity grids and data centers. I don't know if people have been reading recently, but there was a lot of investment into micronuclear. It seems like a lot of these micronuclear companies aren't delivering on what these hyperscalers were expecting, and a lot of their share price have actually dipped, which means that we're stressing out an aging infrastructure of our electricity. And even if you look at it one step deeper, I don't know if people looked into water utilities, but especially in the US, we're already short of water, and a lot of water utilities are run at a loss. And in fact, there's a lot of leakage of water. And it's getting to a point where we've talked to like water experts saying that if data centers are moving in the way that they are, we're going to have to make a decision of water usage for our own consumption and food, which is then going to be in competition with AI. I'd rather not prompt if I'm able to get a glass of water. Thank you very much. But these are things where we need to consider the infrastructure developments, right? It's not to say we can't use AI, but there's much more that meets the eye. And then you talk about all the physical systems that we have. Well, then in terms of then the layers of AI, I will talk about the different stacks that need to be identified by the impact model. So the AI system that we talk about doesn't exist where it's just a mere digital structure. And when we talk about the impacts, there are different layers. And by the way, LCA is like my specialty area, and it's an area that I would love to nerd out with the group on. So anytime anyone wants to talk about the applications of lifecycle to AI, I am the person that just loves to nerd out about this. So people might know AI in terms of its applications, whether they're chatbots, the agents that you use, but there's much more below that, right? We have the models that are getting built, the infrastructure that's needed, the chips. So people might have heard of GPUs. There's also TPUs and MPUs and different chips that we're working on. So we're even working with a big tech firm right now running like AI on a local model with different types of chips to see how much less energy they use versus cloud-based systems, right? And then you have the physical resources. So what meets the eye for certain industries isn't necessarily what other people are operating based on, right? And then there's the whole process that you don't see. So when we type our messages into ChatGPT or Claude, you'll see this user prompt, which is actually the second to last step in this cycle, right? So when you're prompting, this is at the model deployment level. So for anyone that's not familiar with lifecycle assessment, it's the different stages from the raw materials that you need all the way to the end of life, right? And the ideal goal is that you have cascade loops with circular economy that either we're reusing materials or energy and waste, or we're reducing it over the lifetime. So every time that you actually click hit enter in your LLM provider, it continues long after your response appears. So throughout this life cycle, if you look at it, the question is, where is energy consumed? Where is water used? Where are emissions generated, and what materials are exactly extracted? And there's so much more that meets the eye than what we use as consumer. And this touches us on the raw material extraction. So if you didn't know, there is a lot that goes into the silicon chips and the AI chips that we need. So NVIDIA, for those that don't recognize them, they're one of the biggest developers of AI chips right now. And if you look at it, there's a lot of critical minerals that are used, right? You have gold, you have tin, tungsten, so many different things. And traditional mining is one of the most polluting industries, right? We need a lot of this material also for our phones, our cars, our solar panels. It really depends on it. So the chips that also use the gold, tin, tungsten, and like tantalum they're really conflict minerals that are extracted in regions where there are already political instabilities of war. So anyone that knows like lithium ion, right? You have batteries that also come from the Congo. Sometimes we don't actually look at it. And that's where profits can be made. There can be forced labor. There can be severe human rights violations. And there's also a lot of competition for these minerals, right? We need gold. We also need copper for like our wind. We need them for our renewable energy. So would I rather have AI chips or renewable? It's like a question mark. And in some ways, there is a shortage of critical minerals. So as early as 2030, there are shortages that are expected on several key minerals like copper and lithium. So if you're listening to me really carefully, copper and lithium are critical for our renewable energy, not only for batteries, but even also for the hardware. So there are going to be geopolitical tensions if we don't also consider this, because there are trade-offs that we need to look at. So this is something that I just wanted to touch on. Then if you go next, you have the hardware manufacturing, right? And so in terms of hardware manufacturing, these critical minerals are made into chips and servers. So when you manufacture them, they're very resource intensive. So servers are the primary component of data centers, and they're really housed in racks. If you must have seen them on documentaries or in person. And these things that make up a rack are standard in metal frameworks that are designed to really protect these critical IT hardware servers, the network switches, and the power distribution. So whether they're server boards, circuitry, they're one of the most chemically intensive electronic components. So we run lifecycle assessment as our own short course. There is so much more that people don't consider, even in the melting down and the reforming a lot of metal. So for example, if you have an aluminum can, if you're melting and reforming that into any material, it actually takes a huge amount of energy just at the manufacturing level. Then you have magnet and data storage, which uses raw earth metals, which are increasingly having supply chain risks. You have heat sinks, which are there to cool, and they're generally manufactured from aluminum or copper, making their real embodied emissions very highly dependent on energy intensive metal smelting. So metals are very, very carbon intensive when you're having to make them into anything. And then finally, you have the semiconductors and the microchips that I just talked about, which then are the most resource intensive manufacturing process that have a lot of complexity. So we need to think about embodied carbon. The easiest example that I give you here, when you buy an electric car is not zero emissions. There was so much that was done to make that car that is emissions intensive. The ideal then goal with the electric car is that you're using less emissions whilst you also use it. We can't forget about the manufacturing. Then we have the data centers. So this is the big data right now. We have reached 67.7 gigawatts of power demand, which is 1.9% of global electricity generation in 2025. The US accounts for 43% of global data center electricity demand right now. It's really going haywire at the moment. And so the real effects, as we talked about, is the water stress, the grid capacity issues. The build out is in low income communities. So that's where I think a lot of different policies are coming up. If anyone sort of followed the policies that are happening, there's a lot of backlash in terms of local communities on not in my backyard. And it causes also noise pollution, right? These servers and data centers are not quiet. And yes, there has been pushback from the local side of things. However, a lot of the infrastructure is already underway. And so an example of this impact can be around Amazon, who's investing in a large-scale natural gas powered plant as part of a huge data center in Texas. So this is one thing that we've noticed with some of the leading net zero committed organizations. They're really struggling to access renewable energy for all these data centers and having to sort of move towards gas powered plants just because of the extent of energy that's required. Now, I don't want to ever call out any big tech firms who are trying to do the right thing, but these are the constraints of just hyperscaling without thinking about responsible build outs and thinking about the further infrastructure investments that's necessary for AI to be responsibly and sustainably used. Then we have training at scale. So if you didn't realize, AI models take a huge one-time intensive process to train. And this demands a huge continuous draw of energy. Basically, you're running servers and clusters for even weeks and months until learning phases are finished. So if anyone's used any AI models, they're almost using AI to also then train more AI models to then update. And there's so many different providers out there that it's just churning so much energy just to even train at scale. And if you focus on that compute, a lot of these models aren't even released yet. There's a constant drive of just the energy required to train models before they become consumer or organizational use. So the size of the model is one of the biggest factors. If you want to know what actually drives the impact, well, the size of the model really massively affects the training commute. So as a model gains more parameters, like what we call the floating point operators or flops, required for every single training step increase linearly without the parameter count. So basically, for people who don't know too much about the history of how AI happened, I mean, it came out from Google DeepMind, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, But there was a theory behind, well, if we double the compute power, we're not going to be able to double the capabilities of AI. But what it turned out to be was that OpenAI found that that was the case, that if you actually doubled the commute, it kind of broke some of the laws that people thought were true. And so if you're continuing to double, that's what's been driving a lot more of these advancements in AI, but we're also hitting a bit of a peak about what AI can do, yet we're continuing to double up and up and up. So in some senses, you can understand how this is also driving more energy intensity every time we're training a new model. So Grok, why is Grok up there? So this was a tiny bit back, which in terms of data, was still moving forward. And you can look at the practical comparisons on the amount of CO2 equivalent. It's insane. So for like 1 year of a human life is 5.51 tons of CO2 equivalent. My goodness, you can compare that with the models. I don't need to tell you. And Grok 4 has used more carbon emissions during its training phase than any other frontier model because XAI relies heavily on off-grid, mobile, methane natural gas turbines in Memphis. So this is also what drives it. It's not just the energy intensity, it's where the energy source is coming from. So if you're using heavily fossil fuel heavy power setups, that's naturally going to cause a lot more impact. So we need to think about this and call this out in terms of providers that are using fossil fuels. It's kind of similar to, I don't know if people realize, but Netflix not that long ago was using fossil fuel powered data centers. And it wasn't that, like, there was a calculation for every hour of Netflix that you watch, you're kind of burning a propane tank. I don't know if people had heard about that, but that's why we also need to like call out organizations on where they're sourcing data and where we get that from, so the energy from. Cool. And then in terms of model deployment, so when you kind of do an individual query cost, it may appear modest, but there are definitely aggregations of millions of users that are compounding this, and that's where there's an invisible load on the environment. So ChatGPT 4.0 is like a midweight or smaller optimized model. So in some ways, there are many different tactics that we've seen in terms of using the right model. The incentive for people who don't care about the climate is that they'll use up their credits very quickly if they use a heavyweight model for very simple things. But there are also not much information on frontier models right now. And I think that's a bit of the challenge, right? Anthropic's Claude 5 family, the Opus 5, which just came out, Mythios 5, which was like held off from public launch. But now it's called Fable for consumers, if people know. And then OpenAI's GPT 5.6 series. These newer frontier models don't have enough information for us to go off. And so in some senses, although a single prompt may take a fraction of power required, some of these ways that we use them and whether it's text or video can really change the demand of that energy. And we can definitely dive into more of the things that we found there. And then finally, what happens when an AI system is retired? Well, in theory, a lot of tech companies have e-waste policies and have internal processes on recovering as much as possible. So obviously that would make sense. If that was the real world, we would have also done the same thing for solar and battery, which we're only starting to do. But in reality, the policies are not enough. Hardware is being retired. It is outdated due to constant innovation in the field. And there's a lot of e-waste that gets exported, right? And we're already seeing this happen into regions like Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, who've become toxic dumping grounds. Basically, if it's regulated in my country, then I'm going to ship it off to someone else. And that leads to toxic exposure. And even if I'm thinking about AI systems in general, this is very similar to solar energy or just anything in circularity. I wouldn't be surprised if we live in a world in the future that is kind of like Interstellar, where my kind of like interpretation of Interstellar is that we almost need to mine like our landfills to get resources because we've extracted too much. And so in some ways, this is also an opportunity cost as well. And so it is then a business strategy. All right. Now is it your turn, Matthias?
I can pick it up from here. Thanks for taking us through that entire system, Neil. That's just one AI system, but how do we actually measure and account for the cumulative environmental impacts as AI adoption continues to grow and systems continue to evolve? So if we take a look at the next slide, let's go through a little bit about the 5 key challenges that we see in the state of the sustainable AI regulatory landscape. So there are 5 key challenges: limited comparability, limited disclosure, fragmented accounting, lagging regulation, and frameworks doing a lot of work to fill gaps. On the first two, let me go into a little bit more detail. With limited comparability, especially with early adopters such as hyperscalers that have started to disclose, right? And I'm going to show you this on the next slide coming up. We don't quite yet have an apples to apples comparison. I'm going to take you through some of those examples on energy, water, and data centers to show this on the next slide. Outside the hyperscalers, the two largest frontier labs, OpenAI and Anthropic, the labs behind ChatGPT and Claude, have provided limited disclosure, as Niels mentioned, on any information about prompts, data center energy, etc. Although potentially disclosure may come with upcoming IPOs, California regulations like SB 253, and interestingly, talent shifting from companies like Microsoft and Google to head up OpenAI and Anthropic's new energy and ESG teams. Let's take a look at the next slide for some of those examples. So for customers, inconsistent disclosure and low transparency from the AI value chain creates measurement and reporting challenges, right? And so when they're looking upstream to find out what kind of disclosure is available, this is the picture that they see, right? And so if you can see some of the hyperscalers on screen here that actually disclose, there's some limited comparability, right? You can see the total energy use and the total water use for some of these hyperscalers on screen in that box here. And we see for water consumption, for example, that is being reported by Google and Meta, but we have withdrawal from Microsoft and Amazon as well. We can also see the asterisks, right, in orange here. These numbers from Microsoft and Amazon, right, these are at an aggregate level and not data center specific as well, right? So we're not getting the level of granularity nor these apples to apples comparisons that provide good transparency and allow us to use that information for decision making, right? And when we look at limited disclosure, this problem is very clear with Grok and formerly known as Twitter, no longer being required to disclose any information since going private in 2022. And so no reporting has actually been found in recent years outside of what we hear in the headlines. And as we've mentioned around Anthropic and OpenAI, historically, they have rented cloud compute, but both are building their own data centers as of 2026. We haven't found any formal reporting just yet, although we do have IPOs on the horizon as well. Let's take a look at the next slide. And I'll take you through the remaining three challenges that we need to solve for as well. So we currently have a fragmented landscape, right? And this includes things like the regulations that are in place now, like the EU AI Act, as well as leading standards and frameworks like the software carbon intensity framework, for example. And some of these cover energy, some of these cover emissions, some of these cover impacts, but not all at the same time. It's completely fragmented. We also see that regulation is lagging, although the EU is leading, right? But legislation moves incredibly slowly. Frameworks are filling the gaps. This is where industry is playing a big role here, but this is not enforceable, right? And so these are, the remaining of those 5 key challenges. And let me show you through some examples on the next slides and what that looks like as well. So what we've done here is tried to map the entire landscape of existing standards and regulations that are coming from various industry-led coalitions or bodies, governments, as well as formal standard setters, right? Now, let me just quickly take you through what you're looking at here. It's a little bit of a complex landscape here, but I'll try and make this fairly simplistic to understand. So what we have here on the y-axis, we have designed for AI sustainability versus general purpose, right? And general purpose here means that it could be just generally applicable to data centers, could be generally applicable to software or overall greenhouse gas accounting, right? And then if you take a look at the x-axis, we see on the left-hand side, you go from voluntary market-driven type of standards or regs, and then you get over to more enforceable, legally binding regs as well, right? And you can see the pretty colors, the green, the darker green, that's industry-led standards, the orange, that's formal standards, and the yellow, that's government regulation as well. And any of the dotted lines that you see around those squares or rectangles, that means these are in proposal or in development as well. Now, ultimately, this will be a great resource for you to click into each and every one of these standards and regulations to learn more. But what we want to get to is that top right quadrant, right, where we are designing for AI sustainability, and we're also getting legally binding regulations as well. But at the moment, we're not quite there yet, right? The closest we've gotten is the EU AI Act, and that's just rolled out in the past couple of months. And we take a look at the next slide, we can actually see what's coming up with that regulation. And a way to describe this is there's more EU and US regulation coming, but this is also uncertain it'll get passed. In the meantime, standards and standard setting organizations are leading the charge on AI and climate impacts. So out of these, there are 4 notable regulations on the horizon that are helping shape the sustainability of AI. The EU's regulatory machine, of course, is this amazing engine and much quicker to enforce. You compare that to the US, they tend to come up against politics, right? And you can see that at the moment, the US Congress bill S4727 on screen. This is the third one from the right. This is still in draft, but needs to pass through the Senate, House, and the president as well. Right. And so we also see that US has a broad focus on deregulation, where it inhibits innovation. And the country typically delegates this to an agency to figure out. So that's one more step removed. Right. And so taking a look at the US and EU, it's unlikely that we'll see these bills have a material impact on sustainability of AI. But at the same time, we have the European Committee for Standardization and IEEE. These 2 standard settings bodies are putting together the sustainability and AI approaches that we need, right? And these are the first ones off the rank. So this is what's happening in the space. We can't rely on regulations to solve this, certainly not at the pace that we need with how quickly AI is developing as well. So let's take a look at the next slide here. What actually isn't being addressed by the existing regulatory landscape, right? Well, ultimately, standards can't do everything, right? We have measurement gaps that are addressable via standards. So inference emissions, for example, from agentic AI are hard to quantify, given one task is made up of a chain of prompts and token calls. There is no real consensus on dividing emissions from data centers when used to run training and inference for multiple tenants, so people that are sharing a data center, for example. Water depletion and embodied emissions of hardware don't neatly fit into corporate reporting, unfortunately. Right? There are also systemic questions and impacts, much more philosophical. What is AI's net impact? Is it positive or negative? Will avoided emissions be enough to outweigh enabled emissions from fossil fuels, for example? And will AI meet Jevons paradox, where efficiency gains are offset by much higher total compute, electricity use, and economic consumption? And then finally, the societal decisions and the consequences of that. What trade-offs about society should we accept to adopt AI? Which industries and countries should benefit from the limited clean energy and water resources? And ultimately, can the AI ecosystem stay within our planetary boundaries as well? Right? Next slide. And of course, regulations will take time, but we're here right now in the moment. So what do? I like to think about this quote here, often in my time off, thinking about Microsoft's Chief Sustainability Officer, Melanie Nakagawa here. Years of this work have taught us that accountability requires more than measuring progress. It means understanding how and why progress happens, being clear about what's working and what's not, and using that perspective to focus our efforts where they can make the greatest difference, right? And so when we take a look at measurement, take a look at the next slide, please. It really involves solving 4 distinct challenges here. So this builds on Melanie's quote. And actually, in order to build a strong measurement system, we need to travel on a journey, right? We need these 4 concepts in order to get measuring and disclosing AI impacts accurately. 1, clear system boundaries. 2, consistent metrics. 3, phased measurements. And 4, transparency as well, right? And so from here, we are going to go pretty quickly, I think, through the next 4 slides. Challenge 1, defining what to measure. How do we solve the fact that AI is being embedded across most software applications and business processes as well, making its footprint increasingly increasingly challenging and difficult to identify and distribute and attribute. And two, consistent AI impact measurement. How do we solve the fact that methodologies and reporting frameworks are still under development with industry consensus emerging? We need a set of standardized metrics and measurement tools that help to establish a consistent approach to estimate and report AI impacts as well. Now, there's a bunch of tools that are available for these at the moment. Call out to Ecologic's Code Carbon and NeuralWatt, which help enable organizations to quantify AI energy use and emissions using transparent, standardized approaches. But there are emerging standards and tools as well that are helping with this in the background. At the same time, we know that we'll need phased measurement. If you go to the next slide, please. Challenge 3 is how we take into account this rapid advancement of AI, right? How do we solve the problem that rapid advances in AI are increasing impacts faster than measurement practices can keep up, right? Outside of us getting a lot faster from a superhuman perspective, we need to start with available data now and increase accuracy as that data availability, that clarity of disclosure, and the methodologies mature as well. This is exactly what Melanie Nakagawa is talking about. We need to start with small steps and iterate and continue with that feedback loop to improve what we're doing. And then finally, to address the challenge of limited value chain transparency, how do we solve the fact that there are significant gaps in environmental data across AI models, hardware, and supply chains? We need to get to a point where we are being transparent. And so, there are opportunities in the space at the moment. For example, Salesforce has rolled out their approach for model cards for each of their models they're using, right? And a specific format to do this. But we do need clear documentation of data sources, assumptions, uncertainty, error bars, for example, confidence intervals, system boundaries, and calculation methods. And these will help us get to much better results that are interpretable, they're comparable, and ultimately improved over time. Now, if we take a look at how we do this from the different roles in the space, if we go to the next slide as well, there is unfortunately no one-size-fits-all approach to measuring AI impacts. I wish there was a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's really determined by your role in the AI value chain, where AI is deployed and where you have the ability to drive change and access the data needed for measurements. We've got 3 different personas that we have seen continuously come up: the AI consumer, the AI developer, and the data center provider. These are incredibly sort of commonplace in the AI discourse at the moment. And this has meant that there's standards and frameworks out there that help to understand, how do these personas and how can they influence the different levers in their sphere of influence to drive measurement outcomes. Right. And so for this webinar, we're just going to go through the AI consumer, right? And this is probably most on the call today, the AI consumer that focuses on a lot of the existing software that you are purchasing, have already purchased, have subscriptions for, are integrating AI directly into that software as well, right? And so as this becomes more prevalent, how do you take into account this ever increasing amounts of AI usage within your organization, right? And so when you're measuring AI impact for this specific persona, we are naturally looking at these key drivers here, right? How can you manage your AI usage? Environmental impact scales as AI is used more and more often and across more apps and users, right? And the way that you measure that is looking at the requests, tokens, active users, or the total consumption of compute by the application or use case. You can see some of the functional units that you might use in a lifecycle assessment on the right-hand side. You might also look at specific vendors or provider data, right? Each AI provider's footprint looks pretty different, and it could be based on a few different areas like carbon intensity of electricity, the energy grid, the underlying hardware, but also how efficient the data center is. And we can also take a look at the model selection customization. And this is a really interesting part of the sustainability, but also usability of AI conversation at the moment, as we've shifted from this token maximum position that people have taken to, okay, now we need to be a bit more specific on which models we should use. And this actually has a really interesting sustainability overlap as well. If I show the next slide, this is a great example where we've seen this happen, right? EY has an AI router that they've rolled out across their sort of key departments that are utilizing and deploying AI. They use this router which matches prompts to the most appropriate model based on task complexity. And this means that simple tasks are routed to simpler, smaller models, right? And more difficult, complex tasks are routed to frontier models as well. And I think this is similar to what George had mentioned in the chat right at the beginning of this webinar. This can lead to a massive amount of token reduction whilst maintaining employee productivity as well. So when you look at these strategies that are available, the top ones here, optimizing AI usage, selecting lower impact AI services, and deploying AI where it creates net benefits. This is a key sort of 3 steps that for this AI consumer, people are taking in as a great bit of a recommendation here. It actually aligns with the World Economic Forum's net positive AI energy framework as a potential blueprint here, right? These 3 action drivers: design for efficiency, deploy for impact, and shape demand wisely as well. And so that brings me to the next slide, which ultimately understanding each persona better enables better collaboration. Think from policymakers, from consumers, from enterprises, and of course from data center providers, AI developers as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Neil, who's going to bring us home for the remaining of the webinar.
So where does this bring us? Well, we felt so convicted. I mean, we have so many more slides to share. We had to cut so much. We always have way more than we want to share. And it's like, this scratches the surface. I know there's been so much discussion here, and this is what I love. And I understand that this is a very conflicting space to be in right now, but it's something that we really can't ignore. So we feel that our job is to really use our coding experience and to really help to drive forward outcomes. So when we talk to the thousands of professionals out there, they told us that we don't need just yet another upskilling course. Like, the training on this is important, but we want to actually produce something that we can deliver in our organization or within our portfolio. So rather than yet another academy, we are launching an accelerator where we are going to go deep and have specific deliverables that you can work on in teams. So this can be an individual. You can come in, we'll match you to a team, or you can come in even with another team member from your organization, from your network, or from your industry. And the goal is for us to go through like 4 weeks of intensive framing and training, kept within a full-time schedule, but then give you 4 weeks to then develop an output and a demo of something that you can bring back. So the way we're structuring it is we're starting on October 19th. We're going to have the first 4 weeks of 3 different live cohort sessions. Sounds like a lot, but each of them are just an hour 15, around 11 to 12:15 Eastern. So we've really done a lot of work to try to make this work with people with full-time schedules. But even if you're not available for that, that's where we can really dive in, because we have a lot of the sessions recorded. And then we're bringing in industry speakers on these key topics. So the 3 different tracks that we think are doable within any organization is a responsible AI policy or governance, which is track A. Track B is actually measuring the impacts on where you are in the value chain, as Matthias said, and having an action plan that still works with the responsible use, but also the reduction of what's in your power. And then track number C, which I feel like is going to probably be very, very popular, which is how do you buy, build, and scale AI responsibly, whether it's from the vendor due diligence that you apply to the software solutions that you're purchasing, or even in terms of building a solution for a change. And that's where we get into the group work. So the reason why it's 8 weeks is because we want to give time for people then to develop and then present their demos at the end. And that's where I think the community can come together to come up with the solutions that we need in our world. We'll make sure that we account for the Thanksgiving break so we can get it all done this year. We need this work to be done, and not in terms of conviction, but the executives and leaders of organizations are waking up to the fact that work needs to be done. So in terms of building, we have these 3 blueprint tracks that we're going to work on and put people in teams on. Again, this is application only because we want to make sure people who are applying for this really will put in the work to learn and to do the work. We're not going to overwhelm people, but we just want to make sure that people are committed to start to integrate and use this accelerator to be a Trojan horse to really help what organizations are already looking for their team members to produce, which is ways to responsibly and sustainably use AI in our future. So the policy, we've already developed our own. We'll be sharing that. That could be for committee-ready policies or position statements with your sustainability teams to other people. We also have AI impacts. We also then have the build. And so the build track C, which is an interesting one, is either you can develop your own vendor due diligence, which is what questions do you need to ask your providers? Because the more questions that are asked, the more I think that these vendors will then be incentivized to give you the information. Then option number two is to design your own AI agent to actually use sustainable AI principles in its use cases. So we don't want to ignore the fact that AI is here and it can be used for a tool, but within the responsible use. I think using it without actually understanding the impacts can have much worse impacts than what we can think. And so the goal is that we upskill everyone across all three tracks. So you don't have to pick at that point in the first 4 weeks. Then you choose the track, or you can already pre-think about the track that you want. And in a team, whether you self-develop it or we put you into it, you will literally work with our industry practitioners and our expert network to develop an output that then can be organizationally ready. And we're thinking about really cool ways to use like AI responsibly to like help to speed up and tailor those outputs such that you can then get a sense of our influencing skill and power mapping workshop to be able to think about the first set of stakeholders and how to actually build a plan that can be funded and can work on. So with that, I'm ready to sort of take on questions. I'm going to leave this up here and switch to Slido, but anyone that attended today, and we'll send you an email. Seats are limited for this. We're really looking for professionals who are willing to commit. But if you apply, you can use the early bird code when you apply. And if you're accepted into the founding cohort, we'll then send you an exclusive discount. Yeah. And again, we're trying to review these applications to make sure that we pull together a great founding cohort to do this work. So if you want to visit our landing page, Denise can also share with you in the chat. It's opf.degree/sustainability-and-AI. Sorry for the mouthful, but you can also use the QR code. Would love to hear your feedback. So you can email Matthias or I, or just at info@opf.degree, or just shoot us an email, Matthias or I at opf.degree if you have any kind of questions, because we'll be gathering more and more, and hopefully we can get more of this work done, and that the work then creates a ripple effect of change over time. I'm really excited. We put so much work into this, and it's going to be a really exciting time for us to move where the spotlight is and make sure that sustainability continues to get the attention that it needs in a space that's getting an outsized amount of investment, but not enough of people kind of leading the charge in what we need to do today. So great. Julia, do you want to sort of mention any kind of quick questions that were coming up? And as I bring that up, yeah.
I've been trying to answer some of them as we've been going. I know there's one, I think that Heather left that I haven't answered yet. So maybe Matthias, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah. So the question here is, why are data centers focusing on micronuclear instead of large solar arrays? Installing solar and creating their own battery system is more affordable. And it looks like there's 3 votes here. It's such a great point here, right? It makes so much sense that we're thinking about cost. Like, if it's cheaper, why don't you deploy it? And it's interesting that the cost curves, although they've gone down on solar and battery, aren't actually relevant in this situation here. Now, I think the hint is sort of in the micronuclear here. I guess you're talking about SMRs, for example. There was a great Sightline Climate article that came out this week about the renaissance of SMRs. But ultimately, what buyers are looking for to actually power their data centers is not the cheapest option, right? Because they have massive margins on their AI models, right? They have massive, something like 80% margins on those prompts that you're using. But what they're looking for is baseload power, right? So they're looking for firm, clean energy, right? And so that's where micro sort of nuclear is a great option. They are also looking to bypass the grid as well, right? And they're looking for baseload energy that is more easy to connect to the grid as well, that requires a lot less space as well, right? So there's a land element here, which means that solar arrays, right, to get like a 1 gigawatt nameplate, for example, you need massive amounts of land. and you need to then install the battery. You then need to wait for the interconnection queue. Now that's going to take 3 to 5 years. There are those that are going with gas turbines, for example. They're banking on things coming online the next 2 to 3 years, right? And that speed to market is what they're paying for now, right? And that's why we're in this very fossil fuel and SMR sort of purchasing behavior environment at the moment. So hopefully that answers your question, Heather. Maybe I'll pass back to Julia for other questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. Okay, so I think the next question is, with AI growing fast, what is one compliance or safety rule people should learn to avoid problems at work? I think we probably have some ideas here based on, just what we've had to include in our own AI policy. And I don't know, Matthias, if you want to mention anything around, client data and things like that.
Yeah, I think in this, what do you include in AI policies? It's interesting because most organizations will start off with data and security. Certainly, most more advanced sectors that have adopted AI, for example, like the financial services sector, care a lot about data privacy and confidentiality as well. And so it's interesting when you think about like local models, you're able to keep your information in a very closed system, versus if you're using cloud-based systems like, say, sort of ChatGPT, for example, data is used as training, right? And so you need to have a set of tiers which aligns with how sensitive and confidential that information is, right? So if you need HIPAA compliant health data that needs to be protected, you may need to have a specific local model that protects that data and keeps it on premises as well. And if you get to even more intense high scrutiny work, like government work, for example, you may need to have that on premises air gapped as well, so it doesn't have access to the internet, right? And so interestingly, this is where local models play a massive role in the future, where data privacy and being able to run a cheaper model locally, as those capabilities increase, you'll see more of those capabilities being adopted within corporates as well. I'll speak to you, Julia.
And with that, I think we're at time. So sorry we couldn't go through more questions. I think we can make a commitment to take a look at these questions and reach out. And I think this was really starting to layer in the fact of what we kind of need right now. So with that, we will send you an email. Look for it in your inbox. We're going to send you takeaway slides. I know that there was a lot to share. I hope that you valued and you learned something from this. We have so much more to share. So much more to share. And I hope to see some of you guys' applications in our accelerator. I think we want to create an army of people creating outputs that are going to drive change, and also to give people confidence to act in this space. So thank you so much to our long-term supporters and those that may have just stumbled upon our Luma. We really appreciate you for contributing to what we need in this world. Thank you, everyone.
Great to see you all. Happy Wednesday. Take care, everyone.